Hello, I'm Joseph Dillard, and welcome to the IDL video curricula. Emerging potential is the term integral deep listening uses for an interviewed image, whether its source is a dream, nightmare, fiction, a waking event, mystical or near-death experience, or some self-created image that is the personification of some life issue, such as a little mouse personifying fear or failure, or a raging fire personifying anger. Emerging potential is used because it is both a superior descriptor of the manifested presence of these perspectives when they are interviewed, and because it makes no assumption about the ontological status of these elements. Images, dreams, characters, personifications, symbols, and interviewed emerging potentials are all perspectives. What makes a perspective an interviewed potential is the act of interviewing itself. If an image is not interviewed, we are simply projecting our assumptions and meanings onto it, and then declaring that we know what it is. For example, the image of a light bulb might be associated with light, heat, fragility, or inspiration. Which one? Or multiple? Or none of the above? How do we know? To repeat, we're simply projecting our assumptions and meanings onto that light bulb and then declaring that we know what it is. This is both presumptuous and ethically questionable because it demonstrates a lack of respect for the intrinsic perspective of the light bulb. Terms like symbol, archetype, self-aspect, subpersonality, parts, subjective. All of these imply either a derivative or subordinate existence or identity to images and perspectives. In the case of symbol and archetype, the implication is that imaginal elements represent the self or some aspect of the self, recognized or unrecognized, conscious or unconscious, personal unconscious, collective unconscious. Is that so? How do we know? We don't know unless we ask. Otherwise, how are we not simply projecting our assumptions onto images and perspectives? In the case of self-aspect, subpersonality, and parts, the assumption is that images are self-creations. How do we know this is to be the case? We don't. We are simply assuming. Is that smart? Is that respectful? None of these terms consider the perspective of the element itself. What does the fire say that it is? How does the little mouse define its identity? Does it matter? Well, it may not matter to you, but it may matter to the fire or the mouse. We don't know until we ask it. Similarly, if I assume that you are an aspect of me or a symbol, that may not matter to you, but then again, it may matter quite a bit to you. You may experience your identity and autonomy discounted and ignored. But how do I know unless I ask you? All those descriptors assume that some other authority, usually ourselves, provides an accurate determination of the meaning and value of this or that image. Let's think about that for a minute. If I assume that you are a part of me without first consulting you, do you or do you not find that presumptuous? Drawing such a conclusion without consulting you is reminiscent of a cognitive distortion called the control fallacy, one variety of which assumes that we know without needing evidence or confirmation. Such a presumption reduces your essence to being contingent on my perception of you. Is that accurate? Is that respectful? Or is that a form of discounting the meaning and exploitation? I'm not interested in crossing a line into some sort of woke discrimination against poor victimized images, something that is reminiscent to arguments of providing human rights to, say, cockroaches. There exists an appropriate and realistic middle ground, one in which images are provided with reciprocal respect, the way you might a dog or a horse, but without thereby providing them with the same rights as humans, something dogs, horses, and particularly images do not ask for nor require. But to assume that an image is a symbol does not ever necessitate interviewing to discover its actual preferences is a form of reductionism and a discounting of autonomy and value. It declares that worth and meaning only exists in terms of how you and I value a perspective. Is that correct? Is that realistic? Is that fair? Is that just? Is that ethical? IDEO views this common assumption of our determinations as being the rightful arbiter of value as a form of unrecognized arrogance and narcissism. It calls it psychological geocentrism, and when this evolves into excessive grandiosity, it's called psychological heliocentrism. The reality is, I don't know who you are. I don't know what you are. I don't know what your preferences are for certain, unless I ask you. Short of asking you, I can make inferences based on your actions, what you do and don't do, what you've written and haven't written. Those inferences may well be correct. However, they may not. Instead, they may be convenient rationalizations that allow my exploitation of you. Examples abound. For example, the assumption by Westerners that non-Westerners were primitive or even less than fully human was a rationalization and presumption that allowed the unethical exploitation of others for centuries. That process continues today. As I write this, the West is consumed by a bad case of "the Russians are coming" hysteria, despite the fact that the Russians consistently declare they have no intention of invading other places, including the Ukraine. So regarding human projection, that does not take into consideration the perspectives of others, or if so, discards, discounts, or deliberately misconstrues them. This is not a matter of abstract philosophical conjecture. Now, interviewing images and extending to them a degree of respect we demand for ourselves is admittedly a radically different position from mainstream psychotherapy and philosophical contemplation about the nature of the self and experience. Ever since the days when thoughts and dreams were first understood to be self-created rather than visitations by God, spirits, or demons, and particularly since Freud and Jung, in the first half of the 20th century, humanity has erred on the side of taking responsibility for inner experience. IDEO completely agrees with this presumption because prepersonal and personal development are largely dependent on and mediated by learning to take responsibility, often in the form of control over ourselves and our behavior. Concepts like personal unconscious, self-aspects, parts, and subpersonalities help us to do so, help us to take responsibility. IDEO recognizes the need and importance of taking responsibility for our images when we ask, quote, "Character, what aspect of your human do you most closely personify?" We ask this in every interview in order to generate an awareness that ownership and responsibility are fundamentally important developmental steps in building relationship with the other, whether experienced as objective or self-created. However, we could, and sometimes do, follow that question up by asking, "Character, what aspect of yourself does your human most closely represent?" By traditional psychotherapeutic and philosophical thinking, this question means that our reality and identity is dependent on that of some imaginary element. On the surface, this looks absurd. However, is it any more absurd than the first question? Why? The benefit of this second question is that it radically decentralizes identity. It represents a shift from psychological geocentrism and heliocentrism to polycentrism. The relative autonomy demonstrated by interviewed emerging potentials in the context of the assumption of reciprocal respect is a large part of what makes IDL an experiential multi-perspectivalism. IDL does not view emerging potentials as not being parts, subpersonalities, or self-aspects. it simply does not limit them to that assumption or belief. It says that our images are self-creations and more. This more is referenced by the term indeterminate ontology, which means that we cannot conclusively say that imaginal elements are completely self-creations or completely other, but instead lie somewhere on a self-other continuum or spectrum, in a gray zone between black and white. While most images, like dream houses and cars, are easily categorized as self-creations, it is not so easy when your deceased Aunt Lizzie appears in a dream or you have a mystical encounter that is more real than waking life. Shamanic experience is full of such examples. However, these are easily tossed off as self-delusion, and IDL has no problem acknowledging that many are. But how do we know unless we take the perspective of the image itself into consideration? What are the ethics of assuming that we know the perspective of another without asking? What are the ethics of me assuming I know who and what you are without taking your perspective into consideration? If we ask a dream character, say a dream mallard, about who and what it is, and it says, I personify a part of you that blathers on without thinking, then IDL is happy with that. If we ask and the dream mallard says, I personify a part of you that blathers on without thinking, and I personify a perspective that flies free of your assumptions about who you are and what I am, then IDL is happy with that. If the dream mallard says, I am your totem animal or muse, as in classical Greek tradition, visiting you to remind you that I am here, watching over you and guiding you, then IDL is happy with that. Emerging potential is a term that covers all three of these varieties of encounter, as long as potential is not assumed to mean potential of myself or myself with a capital S, and thereby subsumed to some possible definition of who you are. Emerging potentials are better conceived of as bubbling out of the unlimited expanse of universal entropy and formlessness that has nothing to do with you as a self or self with capital S. Entropy cannot be about you and me and remain entropy. Creativity cannot remain subordinated to the self and self with capital S and at the same time reveal contexts that transcend the self or self with a capital S. Creativity has to be born of a condition or context that includes but transcends both. For IDL, images arise in interdependence with who we are, and so are inherently neither completely independent of us nor completely subjective interior aspects of ourselves. Images, whether from dreams or life issues, become for IDL emerging potentials when interviewed. Where the worldviews and recommendations of multiple interviewed emerging potentials intersect, we are pointed toward the priorities of our unique life compass, and that alone stands as a powerful, important reason to interview emerging potentials, a reason that can pass the tests of time. Thanks for watching. See you next time.